Okay, so now what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to talk a little bit more about the epidermis. So what are the epidermal features? And so let me show you a little bit here from a PowerPoint slide. So again, if we're looking at the skin as shown here, then we can see two layers. We have the epidermis, so up here would be the air above your skin. So we've got the epidermis, and then lower underneath, deeper, we will have the dermis, okay? And so what we're going to focus on right now is going to be this top layer, the epidermis, okay? Now hopefully what you can see already is it's made up of a lot of cells. And so this epidermis is actually an epithelial tissue, and it is going to be stratified squamous epithelia. Okay, so the epidermis, if we ask for the type of tissue, stratified squamous epithelia. Because it's located at the skin, then it is also called the epidermis. Okay, so let's take a close-up look at this epidermis, and let's actually look at a real tissue section of the epidermis. So hopefully what you notice is what we've seen before with tissues. Here's the white space, so this is the surface, this is the air above your skin. Okay, and then all of this is epithelial tissue down to right about here. Okay, so all of this is epidermis. And then right here where we go from this darker purple to this lighter pink, this is where we switch to dermis. Okay, now what you may see is that the bottom of the epidermis, okay, it kind of goes in these waves that we see just like this. Okay, so I'm going along the edge of where the epidermis meets up with the dermis with my pointer. Okay, now if we can further subdivide these layers of the epidermis into 4 or 5 layers. This is showing 5 layers. That's what we see in thick skin, which is located on the palms of your hands, okay, and on the soles of your feet. Now, the rest of skin is going to be thin skin, and it is only going to have it's only going to have 4 layers, okay, and this stratum lucidum, that is the layer that is only present in thick skin. We do not see it in thin skin. Okay, so let me show you these layers. First, we've got stratum basale. Okay, that is 1 cell layer thick, and so it runs right along this edge. Okay, so this is stratum basale. Okay, 1 cell layer thick. Above that, the cells here are called stratum spinosum, 8 to 10 cell layers thick. Okay. Right above that, we've got stratum granulosum. Okay. Up here, and stratum granulosum is about 3 to 5 layers thick. Stratum lucidum is 1 to 3 cell layers thick. It's actually quite thin. Okay. And then lastly, we have the stratum corneum, which can be between 15 and 30 layers of cells going up. Okay. So even though thick skin has this extra layer, the stratum lucidum, it's actually the very thick stratum corneum that makes that skin there able to be a little bit thicker than in other areas of your body. Okay, so what I'd like to show you now is a video. I believe it's embedded in your homework, but I'll talk through it. And this is really showing how your skin layers are going to be formed. So what this is showing right here to begin with is this is the stratum basale. It has these cells that all they constantly do is they make babies. Okay, and so let's see what happens once these cells start making babies. Okay, so here's the mother cell, and wow, look, it just gave off a baby cell, and so it pushes that cell up, and it keeps doing that. So this layer of cells was made first, but as the bottom layer that stays put makes the next layer of cells, they push up the ones that were made just earlier. And so what happens is each new bunch of cells pushes the old ones up. Now notice at about here, these cells start to lose their nuclei. What's happening at this point, they're losing their nuclei. They're being packed full of keratin, which repels water, which means they're drying themselves out, which means that these cells are starting to die. So the ones underneath are alive, and these right here, these cells are starting to die. Okay, so what happens is these dead cells keep getting pushed up and up. You notice they get squished flat as this happens, so they become this squamish shape. And then once we get to the very top, notice that these dead cells now flake off and fly away. Okay. In general, depending on what your hormone levels are, it'll take about 2 weeks to go from the daughter cell being formed up to here. Okay, so it takes about 2 weeks for this movement to happen. Okay, and so you can think about that next time you're giving a loved one a hug or a pat on the back. You can think, man, what I'm touching right now is really dead cells. Okay. So, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about what's happening along here in this process. Okay. And so what I'd like to do is go ahead and move back to our notes packets. Okay. So if you remember, stratum basale, this is our deepest layer. Stratum corneum is our most superficial. And then these are in order going from deep to superficial. Okay, I already talked about the number of cells in each layer, so feel free to rewind the video if you missed that. But let's talk about what junctions are present in each layer. So if you need to go back and review your epithelia, remember this is an epithelial layer, and there's different types of cell-cell junctions. These are the things that hold cells together, or else they anchor in cell to that connective tissue underneath. Okay, so let's start with the stratum basale. One of the main sort of cells they're going to have is they're going to have what's called a basal cell. And the purpose of this cell is they are going to divide to produce daughter cells. Okay, and so for these basal cells, they need to be in contact with two things. One, they need to be in contact with that connective tissue underneath. So for that reason, they're going to have hemidesmosomes. And then they are also going to need to be connected to their neighbors. So they will also have desmosomes. And again, if you need to review what these are, go back to the tissues lecture and look at epithelial tissues. Okay. Now we're going to find that there's a couple of other cell types in this layer. We have what's called Merkel cells, and those are going to sense touch. Okay, so these are up in the epidermis and they help sense touch. The last type of cell we're going to have is going to be melanocytes. And these are going to produce melanin. Okay, and so these are the main cells that are going to be there, and we'll talk a little bit more about melanocytes and melanin in a couple of pages in your lecture. Okay, so stratum spinosum, those are going to be, as a reminder, we're looking at these cells that are just above the basal cells. Okay, so we don't need to be anchored to connective tissue. So instead, we are just going to have desmosomes that anchor us to our neighbors, but don't anchor us to connective tissue underneath. Okay. Now at this point, these cells, they start to have a molecule keratin be a part of them. Remember, keratin is the waterproofing or water repelling molecule. And so we start to call these daughter cells that have just been produced, we start to call them keratinocytes because they're starting to be packed with keratin. Okay, so keratinocytes make up the bulk of the layer, and they are they're starting to be packed with keratin, so they provide a little bit of waterproofing, but not a whole lot compared to some of these higher layers. Okay, one other sort of cell that's we're gonna start to see in the stratum spinosum, that is the dendritic cell. And these cells are part of the immune system, and they are going to be roaming throughout the skin looking for anything foreign that doesn't belong there. So any sort of foreign bacteria, virus, parasite, or an abnormal cell, your cell, that may be starting to turn into a cancer cell. Okay, so these cells wander through these layers, the dendritic cells, looking for things that don't belong. Okay. At the stratum granulosum, we're also going to have desmosomes, but here we're going to add tight junctions as well. So this is really going to, those tight junctions, remember, tight junctions don't allow molecules to go in between cells, so these tight junctions not only add strength to the skin layers, but also help with the waterproofing. Again, here we're going to have keratinocytes. And at this point, up until the stratum granulosum, the cells are alive. These keratinocytes are alive. But once we get to the stratum granulosum, these cells are going to be making a lot of keratin. Okay, and so they're going to end up dying from dehydration. Remember that keratin repels water, so once you pack a cell with keratin, it sends all the water outside the cell. And if a cell doesn't have water, it cannot continue to live. Okay, so we're going to have keratin right here down through all of the layers. Okay, again, more keratinocytes in the next layer, and the same for the bottom one, or the stratum corneum. I should say keratinocytes in the stratum lucidum. At this point, they have no organelles, and they've lost them, and they're very flat at this point. And then the important thing about the stratum corneum is that these cells are the ones that slough off. Okay, so if I'm touching my skin right now, you see any little flakes coming off, that is dead cells. And even if you don't see flakes, they're coming off constantly. So that's something that constantly happens. The other thing that I should say is that these melanocytes, they produce melanin. So another important chemical that we're going to find here in the stratum basale is we're going to start to see this chemical called melanin be produced there. Okay, so I just point out that you have this section for you to describe the growth of the epidermis in your own words. So I would see if you can take what you saw in the video and try putting it into your own words and see if you can make sense of it. That's often something that I really suggest that any student, any person trying to learn something does. If you can state it in your own words in a way that's correct, complete, and makes sense, then you probably really understand that concept. If you just have to copy words down off of the book page, but you don't really understand completely what it means, enough to put it in your own words, you probably really don't understand it. And that's where you need to reach out to your instructor and ask your instructor for some help. Okay, and so I believe, I guess the only other thing that we'd add in here is that the accessory structures that we're going to find here, probably the biggest accessory structures, we're going to have Merkel cells, and those are going to be sensing touch. And so the general function of this layer, it's water repelling, so it serves as a barrier to water. And another big thing, because the cells are so tightly packed together, this is really your protective layer. Okay, so a lot of these functions up here that we listed at the beginning for protection, it's really going to start with this epidermis, particularly protecting from fluid loss, chemicals, abrasion. Okay, so that's where we're really going to see that type of protection. Okay.